the French and the Spaniards and the Italians, and yes, I'm afraid to say the British, that we're rather incompetent at managing our monetary policies, that we keep on having these periods of very high inflation. Germany has managed, throughout these turbulent waters since the demise of Bretton Woods in 1974, to always keep inflation at very low levels. Let's try to peg our currencies to the Deutschmark, and by that import low inflation, a very responsible monetary policy. And that's what they tried to do. And so they went for so-called bands. So you would enter the system by declaring a certain exchange rate, this DS bar. And for the UK, it was approximately 3 Deutschmarks per pound, so that's about 0.33 pounds per Deutschmark. It's just the inverse of that. And so you enter at a particular rate, and then you allow your currency to fluctuate within some very narrow bands. So for most countries, it was plus 2.25%. For the UK, in the beginning, it was plus minus 6%. Yeah? So it's not a hard peg. It's not S has to be equal to that S bar at every single instant in time, but it's throughout the day, make sure that the exchange rate does not move above or below that narrow band of plus minus 2.25% or 6% of that central value S bar. Yeah? And so the UK did that, so this was John Major's pet project, and of course all of his premiership was based on this, on making sure this economic policy was successful. Thatcher had been expelled, had to leave on a few months after this, 7 weeks, I think, after the October 1990, and this was the situation in the UK versus Germany. So inflation was no longer two digits, but it was still pretty high, 8%, whereas in Germany inflation was only 3%. And of course, interest rates were substantially higher as well, in part because these interest rates were necessary to try to bring inflation down. Yeah? And in terms of growth, Germany had was reuniting in 1990, so we've just celebrated the 25th birthday of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was a landmark, historical landmark event. And in the UK was effectively walking towards a recession. So this in part was due to the end of the so-called Lawson boom years. House prices, asset prices were falling, interest rates, as you can see, were pretty high, and in general there was just a lack of confidence about the economy, therefore a lack of aggregate demand. A bit more detail about the impact of Germany's reunification. So, of course, most of the Germans lived in the Western Germany, but you still had about 16 million Eastern Germans, and that includes Angela Merkel, the current head of the German government, sorry. And so all of these Eastern Germans suddenly, overnight, had access to these amazing goods produced from Western Germany. And of course, they went on a bit of a spending spree. Adding to this excitement about the new stuff from the West and the ability to borrow and get it, the authorities in Berlin also decided to try to level standards of living by injecting a lot of money in Eastern Germany, and effectively was trying to increase the quality of Eastern Germany's infrastructure. So there was a huge investment, a huge GT, that again was stimulating demand and therefore economic growth. So in 1990-91, Germany was growing at about 5% a year. Of course, this was unsustainable. It was output growing faster than that natural level. And the Bundesbank, BB is for Bundesbank, so Germany's central bank, decided that they had to increase interest rates to try to cool down the economy. And so they did this throughout 1990, 91, and 92. And of course, because Britain had joined in 1990 officially and was sort of shadowing the Deutschmark a few years before, Britain had to follow. And so this is what happens. If you want to keep your interest rate, your exchange rate constant, you know, this is one of the lessons of this topic, that if the anchor country raises their interest rates, you have to follow. And so Britain, again, had to increase their interest rates every time Germany did the same. And so they increased interest rates by about 2.5 to 3 percentage points. You might think this is not a calamity. Well, given that interest rates were already high and the economy was in a recession, this was just very bad news. And so George Soros and the other guys, they just started suspecting that this was this was just not sustainable. And what they did, of course, was to sell huge amounts of pounds, and while the Bank of England was protecting the fixed exchange rate, that was forcing it to buy enormous amounts of pounds in exchange for foreign exchange reserves. So people were dumping sterling assets in exchange for other assets, in particular German assets, and this meant that the Bank of England had to use its foreign exchange reserves to keep the value of the pound at that target S-bar, about 3 Deutschmarks per pound. And of course, at some point they realized that it was just, the battle was lost. They were losing a lot of money for the taxpayers because they were selling something substantially more cheaply than they had bought it for. And by the end of the day, on the 16th of September, they just said, we're going to leave the ERM. Of course, this is a major mark in contemporary British economic and political history, because what happened, of course, was that the Conservatives lost credibility when it comes to economic policy. And since the crisis, they were always behind in the polls. And from then onwards, it was Tony Blair was elected in 1994 as leader of the Labour Party, and then Labour won the general elections in 1997. And for 13 years you had Labour governments. But this is very, very traumatic for all the Tories, all the Conservatives, because it was essentially the key reason why Labour was in power for so many years. And of course, it was related to Europe. And as we know, the Tories have a very difficult relationship with Europe. And the few pro-Europeans in the Conservative Party, some of the big beasts were part of this episode. In particular, Michael Heseltine and Kenneth Clarke. Yeah, so they're still around, and they're still more or less pro-European. So those that haven't seen the documentary, please do. It's really well done. I mean, it's not going to be amazing in terms of going into the details, but you see, I think you see quite a lot of things. The worry of the politicians about the impact of these things, the amazing ability of politicians carrying on saying until a few hours before the event, we will not devalue, we will not leave the ERM, and then a few hours later, you just have to eat your words. The importance of the motive, the profit motive, all of these young kids really excited and selling and shouting and swearing because they're making so much money on that day. And then it finishes with a less classy act, the editor of The Sun. I'm sorry, it's just, yeah, you know, describing what he did to John Major, and it's just, let me say, he's not very eloquent. But yeah, that's the editors of The Sun for you. This country has the best journalism in the world as well as the worst. Okay, now, so about a quarter of an hour to talk about third generation models of currency crisis. These slides here are really just a revision, so I'll go over this very quickly because all of you are meant to know this from your first year macro. So what's the balance of payments? It's just a summary of all the transactions of, say, the UK, domestic residents, with the rest of the world. And it has two major accounts, the current account and the capital account. So CA, unfortunately, both start with C, so, but the convention is to go for CA for the current account and KA for the capital, because capital tends to get the letter K in economics, as you know, K and L, capital and A. So what's the current account? Well, broadly, it's the balance of trade in goods and services. And then you have a few other things like unilateral transfers, but they tend to be small. What's the capital account? The sum of two types of accounts. Those of you that are studying economics in developing countries, I think you'll revisit this when you look at financial liberalisation and development. The sum of foreign direct investment and portfolio investment. Basically, every time you build a factory in a foreign country, that's going to be FDI. Every time you buy foreign assets, that's going to be portfolio investment. And so the crucial thing is to realise this basic rule of the balance of payments. If you have, so here's just a detail, any transaction that gives rise to a payment enters negatively in the balance of payments. But the crucial thing is this. If you have a flexible exchange rate regime, then the central bank is not intervening in the foreign exchange market. So, literally every second, the demand and supply of the currency have to match, they have to balance. Yeah? So what does that mean? Well, if you, as a country, are running a current account deficit, and this has been the case of the UK for many, many years, as you know, for more than 20 years, then you're systematically importing more stuff than you're exporting. So how do you fund the difference? And the answer is you fund the difference by selling assets, selling foreign assets, right? And if you know, and if you no longer have, you're a net creditor in the world, then you have to basically borrow more from abroad. And so every time you run a capital account deficit, so every time the CA is negative, equilibrium in the foreign exchange market requires you to run a capital account surplus of exactly the same magnitude. Yeah? And so this is how you can fund big deficits in a flexible exchange rate regime. Now what happens if you're a fixed exchange rate, you're in a fixed exchange rate regime? Well, as we know, it's no longer true that the supply and demand of pounds or Deutschmarks or whatever have to be equal at each point in time. Now you've set this artificial price, this S bar for your currency, and you as a central bank, what you're saying is, I'm willing to buy and sell, I commit to buying and selling my currency at this rate, no matter what. And so, if your country is running a current account deficit, and if the capital account is also in deficit, then basically you need to supply the difference between the demand for your currency and the supply of your currency as a central banker. And so you do that by 7 foreign exchange reserves. But of course, the foreign exchange reserves are finite.